Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we're going to be taking a look at the week 1 meta overview where we examine the builds that are being played, the classes that are being selected, and the skill gems that are being used in the current ongoing 3.14 Path of Exile Ultimatum League. If you are new to the channel, then you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. And if at any point in time you'd like to reference any of the data or any of the numbers that we are quoting today, all of our references are going to be included down below in the video description. Speaking of data, we're pulling all of our data today from POE Ninja or from previous research that we've done right here at G3 with previous leagues and previous collection of data from POE Ninja. So that's a long-winded way of saying we're pulling all of our data from POE Ninja, which pulls directly from Path of Exile ladders. During the first week of Ultimatum, players have been choosing to play mostly characters in softcore that are witches, that are shadows, and that are Templars. Now, one note of distinction here is that there is, of course, a difference between Ultimatum SC and Ultimatum SSF HC. This is a wonderful piece of comparison that we can do as players to see whether or not and how exactly trade impacts player choices in the characters that are available and the characters that players choose to create. For instance, when you compare SC choices for Ultimatum between duelist characters and SSF HC choices for duelist characters, you see a massive difference, with duelist at 10% in SC and 24% of player choices in SSF HC. When you see these big swings in between character classes, then you can really see which classes are most impacted, at least in players' minds, when they're selecting starter builds for the early on portions of a league, the differences between an HC league and an SC league, and the difference between a league that's got trade and an economy that thrives off of it versus solo self-found. One big point of interest here is just how popular the Scion is this early on in a league for SSF HC. This is a pretty big number. In fact, from all of my data from whenever we've been doing this over the last year plus time of tracking all of the ascendancies and character choices, this is the highest and the earliest period at which a Scion has been even in the teens, in double digits, let alone taking a relatively prominent spot, a top 4 spot in terms of character classes for character selection in SSF HC. Usually, Scions take a lot of gear and a lot of currency and a lot of crafting to really get stacked up and take advantage of all of the various drawbacks that they've got and overcome those drawbacks, and then take advantage of the extra passive points that they get. And it seems to be that, at least for this league, players are just jumping right in and not necessarily worrying about building 3 or 4 characters and building up a stash worth of gear and currency prior to switching over to a Scion. It seems like more players are simply selecting it from day one than in the past. Another interesting note from the character overview is that the Marauder has actually taken a slow hit over the last year and has slowly been going down, which is pretty interesting because it used to be that if you were playing melee, if you were playing anything in SSF HC, and you just wanted to be able to play a build that you knew could get you to, let's say, level 90 and progress rather smoothly with lots of defensive options, then the Juggernaut was the go-to style Ascendancy, and of course the Chieftain also was available early on, and so those two combining factors made for the Marauder to be a very compelling class for league starters in SSF HC leagues. However, it seems to be that the trend is continuing where the popularity of the Marauder as a league starter class in SSF HC continues to drop. If you're anything like me, then you wonder whenever you stare at numbers, hey, how does this compare to previous numbers of a similar timeline in a similar league? So we compared last league Ritual versus Heist, and now this league we're going to compare Ritual to Ultimatum at roughly similar timetables and progressions of players making choices in their builds. So character comparison between SC Ritual and SC Ultimatum is as follows. Marauder has lost 2% of its popularity overall. Duelist has lost 3% of its popularity overall. The Ranger has lost 1% popularity overall. And the Shadow has lost 4% popularity overall from character selections during Ritual League. Now, the losses of those 4 character classes are to the benefit of Witches, which are up 3%, Templars, which are up 6%, and then Scion, which is up 2%. You might be wondering, why is it that we do this with characters and not just with ascendancies? Well, we'll get to ascendancies here in a moment, but one of the things that's fascinating to see about character comparisons is to see just how big of a chunk a player base is dependent on one particular character, and if there are multiple ascendancies inside that character selection that are preferable, because oftentimes one very, very popular ascendancy will, at least in previous history for grinding gear games, patch cycles and nerf cycles, will get slammed or will get nerfed. So if one particular ascendancy gets hit really, really hard, does that have an overall impact on the popularity of that one particular character? You would think oftentimes the answer is yes. However, as you can see, even with big, big swings, I put air quotes here, big, big swings, the Templar is only up 6% as a character across the board, even though ascendancies inside the Templar class are up across the board from their previous leagues. So we might look at this and say, wow, well, what exactly does that mean, Iron? What do the numbers actually tell us? It means that for character swings to take place in large numbers, the Templar here being a case of a large number, even though the number is only 6%, there's actually a massive swing where multiple different ascendancies need to be perceived by the player base and picked up in terms of their popularity by the player base as being more powerful. It's not just that one ascendancy is seen as being more powerful. It's that the entire character across the board becomes more attractive from league to league for players. Exception to that is when one particular build requires one particular ascendancy, and then you see the numbers really skew out. But we generally don't see that with league starter builds. We generally see that as a league progresses and as more players migrate over to whatever meta build defining kind of character that emerges throughout the course of the lifetime of a league. So a 6% jump in an entire character class across the board for league starters is a pretty big indicator that there's been a large shift in the way how players view the Templar from Ritual to Ultimatum. Moving from characters to ascendancies, let's take a look and see what is popular in both Ultimatum SC and Ultimatum SSF HC by comparison. Our legend down at the bottom of this particular piece of data shows us that a blue line indicates no change in place, which this time around, there are actually no ascendancies that are in the same position or the same popularity from SSF HC to SC. So you won't see any blue lines in this particular chart. Yellow line means that that particular ascendancy is more popular in SC than in SSF HC, and a red line means that that ascendancy is more popular in SSF HC than in SC. In general, if you see an ascendancy that's got a red line on it, it is going to be perceived by players as less dependent on trade and more reliable with defenses than a character that has got a yellow line next to it, which is going to maybe be able to have higher levels of damage output, but is in general going to be more of a glass cannon, more squishy, and higher risk in terms of survivability. In at the top spots for Ultimatum SC are the Elementalist, the Assassin, the Necromancer, the Occultist, and the Ascendant. Rounding out the top 5 for SSF HC are the Ascendant, the Champion, the Gladiator, the Trickster, and the Raider. Now, this is absolutely mind-boggling. The Raider for literally years has been one of the bottom 5 classes in terms of popularity in basically both leagues, especially as a starter. And this league, the Raider, has popped up mostly due to Blade Blast. If you go and you take a look at most of the players who are playing Raider in SSF HC, they're mostly playing Blade Blast, but a few of them are playing other builds as well. And that is a wonderful, wonderful mix and a wonderful, wonderful diversion from the usual trend where Raiders all the way over at the bottom and just hanging out and hoping beyond hope that there could be a buff for the Raider. That's one of the things that makes this so very interesting, is that the Raider is not only popular, it's much more popular in general as a league starter than it has been in the past. It's even more popular in SSF HC than it is in SC, which is, in my mind, mind-boggling, because the Raider really isn't known for being a defensive class. It's got some defensive options, but those defensive options in and of themselves are mostly quality of life defensive options. They are not necessarily simply buffs to your HP. Or buffs to your damage mitigation. That to me is by far the biggest thing that is standing out about this league so far, at least comparing SSF HC to SC, is the fact of where Raider is in both leagues and the fact that it's even more popular in SSF than it is in SC. Beyond that, we've got the Elementalist coming in at the top spot, which, of course, the Elementalist got a little bit of a smack after Ritual, but really it wasn't a smack enough to really change it, and there's enough different builds that you can make with an Elementalist that even if the most popular builds that were playing Elementalist got smacked down, there's enough diversity inside that Ascendancy that the Ascendancy could survive that. Assassin, which has slowly gotten every other league or so little tweaks here and there to its numerical values ever since its rework, still remains towards the top, and it's fascinating to see that players are choosing that again as a league starter. Rather than building, let's say, a Trickster, which has been very, very popular for the last several leagues as a league starter, rather than, say, building a Trickster first or a Saboteur first and then swapping over to an Assassin later on in the league, players are simply going with the Assassin first. These are just some of my observations of the way how Ascendancy popularity is working right now with Ultimatum during the first week. Feel free to drop a comment down below and let me know what you think stands out about Ascendancy choices and player popularity in Ultimatum Week 1. It's like Billy Mays, but wait, there's more. Let's take a look at the skill gems and compare them between Ultimatum SC and Ultimatum SSF HC. In other words, what is it that players are using and relying on to deal damage in the current Ultimatum League? Well, very simply, in SC League, it's Blade Blast. That is the one thing that is comparable in both leagues. Blade Blast is being used both in SSF HC and in Ultimatum SC. In both leagues, it's being used. In fact, only Blade Blast and Vortex, those are the only skill gems that are showing up in the top rankings in both leagues regardless. So in that, you've got some pretty wide diversity. In SC, you've got Cyclone, Burning Arrow, Toxic Rain, Ray Spectre, and then Ice Nova, and even Flame Wall coming in the top spots. Whereas in SSF HC, you've got Exsanguinate, which is, of course, a new skill. Everybody wanted to try it out. Earthquake, Ground Slam, Essence Drain, Earth Shatter, and then also Vortex. I think this is one of the more diverse skill gem comparisons that I've seen, again, over the last year plus of doing this particular stat tracking. Most of the time you see 4 to 5 different skill gems that are rounding out the top 5 or so even choices between multiple different leagues. This amount of diversity, if this is what GGG is aiming for, seems to be a good thing. If GGG is not aiming for this, well, then in that case, this is a wild outlier and ought to be corrected and nerfed to oblivion tomorrow. Lastly, today, I want to start a new feature that we haven't done before, which is taking a look at the passive heat map popular nodes on the tree that players are selecting. Now, I'm not going to do this going through every single Ascendancy. I've tried to narrow this down just by looking at the top 3 Ascendancies by popularity for the opening week in Ultimatum SC. The Elementalist is on the left, the Assassin is in the middle, and the Necromancer is on the right. Elementalists make up 16% of the player population, Assassins make up 12%, and Necromancers make up 9%. These 3 Ascendancy classes make up 37% of the total player population in all of the counts and all of the numbers. In other words, that's not every single player that's playing Path of Exile, but it's 37% of the total calculatable players according to POE Ninja and the POE ladders for this data. That means over a third of the players who are playing SC Ultimatum that are on the ladder are essentially represented in these 3 heat maps. The top half of the tree is a very, very popular thing, and the cluster jewel spots on the top left and top right seem to be the most popular areas for cluster jewels to be placed. Even early on in a league, top players begin including clusters into their builds rather quickly. Note that on the far left side in the Templar tree, the elemental wheel is rather heavily used by 2 out of the 3 Ascendancies. It makes sense that the Necromancer doesn't really use it that much, especially since Necromancers are usually summoner players, but even some elemental style Necromancer players are using that elemental wheel as well. So that entire elemental wheel is relatively popular this early on in a league. We'll see if it drops off later on in the league. Also, that all 3 of the passive heat maps include the Scion Life Wheel, with some classes, like the Assassin, being willing to travel very far out of their way to get to it. Thanks so much for joining us for today's discussion about the opening week and the emerging meta that is coming out of the 3.14 Ultimatum League. I would love to hear your comments down below, any feedback that you've got, of course, any corrections. For those of you that just like to look at charts and data, I've, of course, once again got all those linked in the video description. But my question for you here today is, what has stood out to you about player choices in the meta during the opening week of Ultimatum? To me, it is absolutely fascinating to see the amount of raiders that there are running around both in SC Trade League and in SSF. That to me is by far the biggest like shocker, and just the rise of Templar in general is also a bit of a shocker across the board. But that's just some of my thoughts. What are your thoughts? Let me know down below in the comments. As always, if you like the video, you can go ahead and give us a thumbs up and subscribe. And as always, I hope today is the day that a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.